Zerlina Maxwell, what did you make of how Mayor Pete handled these instances? I mean, obviously, we have a range of women and minority candidates running this time around, so he's certainly not the only one that has to grapple with dealing with stereotypes.
And I think he handled it, with all class. And I think that we're going to see a number of protests. Anti-abortion protesters are going to show up at events throughout this primary, I have no doubt. And so I think it's a test for Democrats, and including Mayor Pete, about how they can handle that type of direct adversity. But I do have to say, I'm glad that he's in the race. I'm glad he's talking about faith, because I was raised by two pastors. So while I'm a progressive feminist, I've often debated folks who are citing the Bible and shouting out Sodom and Gomorrah. That's something that they always say. And I would always push back and say, listen, if Jesus is so great, why aren't you nicer? Why aren't you kinder? Why aren't you more fair and kind to your neighbor and to your fellow human beings? Jesus needs new PR. I mean, I always had that line when I was growing up, because honestly, I think what Mayor Pete is doing is he's demonstrating how to actually be a Christian, to embrace people, to be more compassionate. And I think that's an example that crosses partisan boundaries, actually.
So we've talked about how he's really burst into the spotlight here, and a lot of that has to do with how he handles exactly this type of moment that we have been talking about. And he has answered many, many tough questions in interviews with grace and has impressed a lot of people. But Zerlina, some of our data that our own Steve Kornacki is looking at, and David Axelrod has also made this point, that it seems as though his support is liberal, perhaps higher income, and mostly white. What's your sense of whether he can appeal to, what really is, I mean, the most important constituency in the Democratic primary is African-American women?
I think that any candidate can appeal to African-American women, but what we're listening for is specific. So if you're running for president and you're not telling us how you're actually going to solve problems like the high rates of maternal death and other issues like racial injustice and mass incarceration, but also education and health care, if you're not telling us how you're going to fix the problem, then we're probably going to move on to the next candidate who is articulating those specific policy solutions. And so I think black women are very savvy voters. We're very smart. We actually vote on the issues, and more than one issue. It's not just, one issue that's the deal breaker. So I think that any candidate, including Mayor Pete, have an opportunity to sway that portion of the electorate. But I will tell you that representation is also important. And so while it is so here that such a few percentage of people say that they would be ready for a gay president, we haven't had a woman either. And there are a lot of Americans who voted basically to say we're not ready for a woman president, because 13%, surprisingly 13% of black men voted for Donald Trump in 2016. So these are still issues that we are very much dealing with and grappling with on all fronts.
Yeah, very good point.